takes a minute. Traveling through the tubes of the net. Welcome everyone. We're gonna get going in a little bit. Here we are. Let's get those hearts going. Smash that like button. um, cool. Give it a little moment. Dun, dun, dun. We're getting some viewers in. Get the lobby going. Okay. Dun, 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 dun. Actually, let me ask you a quick question. Can we put this up on YouTube afterwards?
Yeah, I was literally going to ask the same question if it was going to be like
Awesome.
archived somewhere. Yeah, that's perfectly fine.
Yeah, it saves it. It saves the Twitch videos, but then I learned it doesn't save them forever, and so I'm gonna start a YouTube channel.
Cool.
Very exciting, a new platform. Well, I think we'll get some more people. We're starting to get some people into the chat. Um, yeah, I'll just do a quick intro for you, and then we can get going. But yeah, thanks for joining us. Um, For the latest OK #1 stream, we are here with Jaden Janak, who is from Tulsa but is in Austin pursuing their PhD, and they are an abolitionist. They're someone who's been working and studying prison industrial complex abolition for a long time, and not just as it's kind of recently surged into all of our consciousness. And so, yeah, very excited to have them talk with us and share some info, answer common questions we may have or questions we may be getting as we try and talk to other people. And just bit of information. Jaden's gonna talk, and they can't see the Twitch feed, so please just leave your questions in the chat as they come up, and then we will get that to them at the end. We'll relay those over. And last little note, you can see up on the screen we have highlighting the Marsha P. Johnson Institute and Survived and Punished, which are two abolitionist nonprofits that we encourage you to donate to and support. So, without further ado, I'm going to stop my video and present to you Jaden Janak. Oops. Uh, how do you go full screen? Speaker view. There we go.
Cool. So we should be good. Yes, we're good.
Yes,
Okay,
we're good. We're good.
perfect. Hi everyone. I'm happy to be here. Lucas reached out to me a few weeks ago to put on this event in light of the rebellions that are happening and new folks sort of coming to abolition and wanting to know what we mean when we say abolition. And so today's talk is called Making New Futures: Why Abolition Can't Wait. Like Lucas said, I've been struggling and studying prison abolition for the past 6 years. My journey with prison abolition started with my organizing work in St. Louis. I started college there 2 weeks after the murder of Michael Brown. And so my collegiate experience was enraptured within what we now know as the movement for Black Lives. And at an action I attended my first year of college, I I can remember the moment where I realized that what happened to Michael wasn't an aberration. It wasn't random, and it wasn't a singular event. I was at an action and I saw the police pull a young trans kid who was standing on the sidewalk and throw them against the ground. And they were screaming and crying. And it shook me really deeply. And after that moment, um, in movement spaces, we started having conversations about this thing that we now know as abolition. And like any young abolitionist, I did the first thing that everybody does, which is pick up a copy of Angela Davis's Are Prisons Obsolete? Um, and I read the book and I was like, okay, like I can get down with this. But my understanding of abolition was as the opposite of reform. That my understanding of abolition was that it was a politics of critique. And so today, what I want to do is convey that abolition is not a politics of critique, but rather is a politics of creation. It is a politics of world making. Um, Today, what I want us to do is to examine abolition on its own terms and to see what abolition offers us in terms of a different definition of health, safety, and wellness, of not only human life, but also non human life. So there will be many people in the coming weeks, and this has already happened, who will explain why reformist efforts are um, incomplete to at best. Um, and so, there will be people who will explain why reforms like 8 Can't Wait actually expands the carceral state rather than limits the carceral state. But that's not what I want to do today. I want to focus on what abolition can give us. So for the next roughly 25, 30 minutes, I'm going to give a few examples of what I think abolition can give us in terms of suggestions for world making that we can all take part in. And then I'll conclude, and then we can have time for some Q&A and any sort of questions that folks have. So firstly, I want to say that abolition gives us a new way of relating to one another. So we have to understand that abolition necessitates that we see violence in 3 different ways. So harm doesn't just occur between individuals. That is one way harm occurs. Harm also occurs within communities, and harm also occurs through the state. So I can give folks examples of that. So an individual to individual harm, I rob you. That is an impact from one person to another person. Community harm would be something like gender-based violence that happens when feminine people walk outside and get catcalled. That's communal violence that gets justified because of patriarchy. And then we have state violence. So cops killing people, the existence of prisons, strip searches within prisons. These are forms of state violence. Capitalism, that's a form of state violence. What abolition gives us is an understanding that my relation to you, an individual, but also my relation to communities, but also my relation to the whole world, human life and non-human life included, has to be different. We have to reimagine how we connect with one another, which means that arbitrary binaries such as good people, bad people, guilty, innocent, can't exist within this world-making endeavor. And this means that, as Mariam Kaba teaches us, that abolition is a vision for everyone, and that includes killer cops. That means that we have to find a way to imagine beyond the carceral state, beyond prisons, beyond police, and find a way to form community with one another, particularly amongst people that we often would not. So for me, as an abolitionist, it is very difficult for me to talk to cops. But if we're going to engage in a world making process that asks that we change everything, like Ruth Wilson Gilmore asked us to do, then we need to be able to practice abolition on smaller scales. That means when a loved one harms me, says something transphobic to me, I need to be able to work that out. We need to be able to practice our abolitionist principles on smaller scales, even amidst extreme harm. And so, one example of how abolitionists are thinking are experimenting with this idea of changing our relation. There's a group out of the Bay Area called Bay Area Transformative Justice Collective, and one of its members, Mia Mingus, is working on how to address childhood sexual violence without relying on the carceral state. And so, one sort of um, world making activity that Bay Area Transformative Justice Collective engages in is called pod mapping. So, I can send along the worksheets, but what they do is ask people to map out who their communities are. And so they're asking people not necessarily like, oh, my community is my mom, my dad, but who would you call in the midst of an extreme emergency? And not the police. So who in your life would you call who's not the police? And what they found is that often people only name 2 to 3 people that they would call if they were in crisis and needed assistance and didn't need judgment and needed care in that moment. And what abolition invites us to do is to expand those pods, to do the work on smaller scales and on larger scales institutionally to change the way that we form connections so that in an abolitionist future, I don't have 2 to 3 people in my pod. I know that the people in my community, I could call them and say, I'm having an emergency. I need your help. And I can be assured that I could survive that encounter. So, abolition gives us a way of changing our relations. I want to bring us to point number 2. Abolition is a transnational and international vision. So often we will hear in conversations about the criminal and justice system, we will hear the positing of Black men, cis Black men, as sort of the most oppressed. If we're going to play oppression Olympics, it's Black men are being targeted and gunned down by the police. What abolition asks us to do is to broaden our lens. That we have the capacity to form linkages and solidarities across time, across space, and across region. That abolition is not a singular project. Abolition is indeed everything. So, one example of this we see in Egypt. So, following the 2011 Egyptian revolution, community members, young people particularly, formed these groups called popular committees. And these committees sprang into action when it became evident that the state was failing the people. And these committees were in every neighborhood, made up of neighborhood citizens. And they found ways to provide water, to provide healthcare, and to provide safety to those in their communities. It's important that we uplift these sort of examples because if we don't, we might think that abolition is a Western vision. And it simply is not. So I'll give you another example of work that's going on right now. So there's a group of a sex worker alliance in Thailand called Empower. And right now, they're engaging in mutual aid in light of the state not providing sex workers with unemployment, right? So we're in the middle of a pandemic. Lots of folks who are low wage workers and in the underground economy have attempted to find ways to live and to survive in the midst of all of this. Um, and Empower has found a way to support their own community, right? When we see that the state has failed us, we know that we can rely on the people who are around us. Um, and that's really what abolition asks us to do is to see that it takes all of us to sort of engage in this creative project. So I will bring us to my third point. Abolition necessitates the creation of new infrastructure. And this new infrastructure would then limit premature death. Abolition is a vision that is necessarily communally centered, where we can find non-carceral and anti-carceral ways of dealing with the three levels of harm. So right now on Twitter and Instagram, within movements, we see people reckoning with the very real existence of gender-based violence within even within our movements, and people are sort of debating about so-called call-out culture and cancel culture, and how, as abolitionists, we are called to deal with this very real reality. And what sort of our movement elders are telling us is that any sort of isolationism, any sort of punitive action like that is necessarily rooted in the carceral. And abolition invites us to find a different way. So, something that folks in movement circles have been doing for a very, very long time is something called transformative justice. So, or even restorative justice. They're separate processes. Sometimes they get used interchangeably. But these processes, what they do is find ways to account for harm. So it's impossible I can't hold someone else accountable. That is sort of a fiction. What I can do is provide a process that invites a person to hold themselves accountable. Anytime I'm saying I will hold you accountable, that is necessarily punitive. And abolition gives us another way. So there's an example that Dr. Angela Davis often gives from the very end of Our Prisons Obsolete. And she talks about during the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa, it came out that there were these soldiers who murdered an American citizen, a white girl. And those two soldiers were able to speak with the family of the person who died. And they were able to work through, not push past or pretend it didn't happen. They were able to talk to one another and to work through the harm and now they run a successful anti-violence nonprofit organization. And I bring up that example because abolition is an experiment, right? We are creating a future we are not promised, and that there is no blueprint for what an abolitionist future is. But what we know is that we're not necessarily starting from scratch. That people for the past 400 years have been engaging in abolitionist imaginations for how the world should be. We can even think to the United States example of Reconstruction, though it was a failure. Reconstruction was an abolitionist vision, a vision for abolition democracy, as W.E.B. Du Bois puts it in Black Reconstruction. These experiments are not always successful. They're not always translatable to large scale implementation. But what we can learn from these experiments is to have the audacity to not only question the carceral state, but to find alternatives within ourselves. We as a community have all the solutions that we need. We don't need the state. We don't need police. We don't need those things because we have the ingenuity within ourselves to create these things. We have examples from all around the world for centuries of how people are thinking through, experimenting, failing, and finding new ways to create livable lives for their societies. And so with this, in 2003, Dr. Davis asked the question, which is still a provocative question, are prisons obsolete? And it's time that on a large scale, we ask the same question about capitalism. Obviously, Black communists have been doing this work, again, for centuries. Claudia Jones being a prominent Black woman communist who was thinking through the connections between racism and capitalism. Cedric Robinson, who famously coined the term racial capitalism. An abolitionist future is necessarily anti-capitalism. Capitalism necessitates power over one another. My success comes on the back of someone who doesn't have a home. And what abolition gives us is sort of a way forward without that. What does relying on communities look like without relying on money, without relying on the stock market, without relying on police? So I'll conclude with this. Prison abolition is not new. Prison abolition is a political movement that ties in to anti-colonialism, anti-slavery movements, feminist movements, queer and trans-led movements, anti-capitalist movements. And those of us who maybe are coming to abolition right now are in very good company. You are not alone. You are not the first to question the police or to question jails or to question police or to question the immigration system. We have people to look to help guide us in our quest for this new world. It's important to know that abolition is a political movement that requires real political commitments. Recently, if folks have been on Twitter and Instagram and even Facebook, you will hear potentially people identifying as an abolitionist and calling for the arrest of police officers who've murdered Black people. And while I understand the gesture, that's not abolition. I understand it. I get it. I feel myself having to check that impulse, but that's not abolition. Abolition is a political movement, a vision that asks us to create a world where health, safety, wellness is guaranteed to everyone. That world can't exist if prisons exist, if cops exist, if punitive justice exists, if progressive prosecutors exist. Abolition can't. So I'll end with this. There once was a time without prisons, and I believe strongly that that time has come again. Thank you.
Here, I'm bringing my own audio into the chat. Um, excuse me. We don't. So if anyone has questions, please ask them in the chat, and we can get to them. Just relaying some messages. Amber says, "You and your ideas are absolute golden," and love the idea of the pods. It promotes both connection and accountability, but also intentionality. And then Crystal97 says, "This was great, Jaden. I'm not as informed on abolition as I should be, but this was really helpful. Abolition is not a politics of critique, it's a politics of creation." That's going to stay with me. Does anyone have any questions they want to ask, or while we have Jaden here? I mean, I think it's something that is just very compelling is that abolition offers this kind of anti-capitalist vision that seems to center care all the way through that process. Wonder if you could talk a little bit about that, or
Yeah, no, I appreciate you saying that. Yeah, so abolition certainly is a vision of care. Um, and that care is requires that I I show up for Lucas, but also that I ask questions and find alternatives to things such as where does my food come from? So there's this prevailing assumption that if one is a vegan or vegetarian, that you've cut out sort of harm from your food process. The unfortunate thing is that there is a lot of harm that happens in our societies that we don't see. And one of those harms is what happens to folks in the fields that pick our food. Often these are undocumented people. And currently in California, there are undocumented people who are currently being held on fields to pick food and are not allowed to leave, and they're being held there by the police and by ICE themselves, right? So they're not arresting them for violating our citizenship processes, but instead are saying you are an essential worker, though I'm not going to pay you. We have a word for that. It's called slavery. And let me wind back. This is about care. Um, we have to be willing to ask those questions, and to analyze how we, even if we aren't necessarily state actors, even if we aren't a prosecutor or a cop, um, or work in a detention facility, we participate in carcerality every day through capitalism. Um, and we have to find new ways of care. Um, and that can happen interpersonally, certainly, but what we're imagining is a communal form of care.
Uh, Thank you. Sorry, I'm clunkily navigating. Um, One question coming in is what are your thoughts on abolition as it relates to anarchy?
So this is I should have said this at the outset that there are many different sort of uh, emphasis emphases. People emphasize different things within their visions of abolition. So if you've heard Dr. Davis speak, she will often use the term abolition feminism. If you maybe are more into sort of like an anti-capitalist critique, you will hear Dr. Ruth Wilson Gilmore talk a lot about socialism. Um, I, as an individual, think that abolition is necessarily an anarchist vision. That is not a widely accepted viewpoint. It's a sort of a contested point within abolitionist circles. Um, there are prominent sort of scholars and organizers who think that a central state is still necessary, right? So, like socialism. I personally think uh, that it is necessarily an anarchist vision, and I don't think that that is a bad thing. In fact, I think that's a good thing. Um, and I think that if we use those terms, it certainly alienates people. I understand that. But it gives us what that term gives us is permission to imagine even more fully. So if you position yourself as the left of the left of the left, there's nothing really off limits for you. People will likely, um, say that you're like way out there. And that in and of itself gives you permission to dream larger and bigger.
Thank you for that. I think that that point. Here's a maybe a slightly kind of practical question, maybe bigger than what we have the capacity to answer. But Elisa, who is letting us use our Zoom account, by the way, thank you to Elisa. Um, Curious what it looks like to dismantle the police and prisons. Would this be a gradual process where pods programs are put in place and then the police prisons would be abolished? I think it's just hard for people to imagine kind of how all these programs intersect, and I don't know if you have thoughts on. It's a big question.
Yeah, no, it's certainly a big question. I can't give you a fully fleshed out roadmap today. But what I can give you is some thoughts on the question. So I often, that's usually the first or second question people ask after they hear my research and sort of what I do from an organizing perspective. Um, and my response to that is this sort of um, asking abolitionists to create a system that works today is perhaps a valid question. But maybe that question should be asked to the people who are currently employed to make the system work. So if we understand that roughly 1% of people who perpetrate sexual assault on a national sort of framework are currently incarcerated. That leaves 99% of people who perpetrate sexual assault free, walking amongst the people in your churches and your schools, leading your sports teams, maybe your partner, maybe your brother, maybe your sister. Um, we have to understand that the system, the criminal justice system, as it is called in the United States, but also globally, does not work. We can even take, for example, the death penalty. So the death penalty was established to as a deterrent, allegedly as a deterrent against sort of heinous, unimaginable harms that individuals commit. But we know that after people are executed by the state, these sorts of harms actually rise. They don't fall, they go up. So I say all of that to say that, and again, thank you for letting us use your Zoom account. This heat is not for you. Um, it becomes sort of frustrating for that burden to be placed on radicals when it's not necessarily being placed on the people who are currently paid to run this system. And instead, they spend their time killing people and incarcerating people and breaking up families um, and profiting off of people's destruction. I think like that is a very important question. And I think that we ought to ask that question to Steve Kunzweiler, who's the district attorney in Tulsa. I think that that's a great question um, to ask of federal leadership as well. And I think that that's a great question to ask to Kevin Stitt.
Thank you. I don't know if we have any more questions coming. I was wondering if just maybe on that note, if we could close like Steve Kuntweiler, Kevin Stitt, um, speaking kind of locally. Do you have, and I guess also on top of like organizations like Survived and Punished, Marsha P. Johnson, that we can support immediately. Do you have any thoughts on local action and kind of maybe what we can spend the next few months thinking about, or not that it's your responsibility again to tell us?
Certainly. I would look to organizations like Still She Rises, which is an explicitly abolitionist organization that grew. It's a satellite organization out of a larger organization in New York that is looking at sort of the roots of violence and harm beyond sort of the individualization of harm. So I would look at supporting their work and plugging into what they're doing. Uh, and I think, you know, right now in the city of Tulsa, the mayor has come under a lot of heat for capitulating to our president um, and his racist goonies. Um, and in some ways, that's like really encouraging. And in other ways, it's saddening for me because he's been engaging in sort of racist actions since the day he got in office. But because there's a veneer of personability, those actions seem to be sort of hidden, right? So, like, um, and so I say that to say that often Tulsans and Oklahomans and people in the South in general get underestimated as not as progressive or not as liberal or not as leftist as sort of the coast, California or New York. And I just don't believe that to be true. I think that we saw during Juneteenth that that is simply not the case. We had folks represent. And currently in Oklahoma City right now, they're working to get political prisoners freed. So that's something that people can certainly directly help. They're working to get folks out of incarceration who have been given ridiculous bail amounts because the district attorney in Oklahoma County said, "We are not Seattle." And so they're throwing the book at folks who dare to protest uh, police violence. So there are a lot of different ways to plug in. We have a lot of examples of people not even on the coast who were engaging in abolitionist work. In St. Louis this past week, the workhouse, which is a medium security prison, got closed. And so they're in the heart of the Midwest, and they were able to make that happen through years of struggle. And so where there is political will, there is a way to make an abolitionist future. And I invite folks to sort of work towards that wherever they're coming from.
Amazing. We have a Mado from Elisa, and Ros Rosley asks, "What are some ways that abolitionists have imagined to practice care for those harmed whose perpetrators do not want to be held accountable?" So, yeah, I guess in contrast to, say, those soldiers who were willing to talk with the family.
Yeah. So one sort of source that talks about the sort of dialectical between abolitionist organizing and the very real reality of gender-based violence and harm is called Beyond Survival, and it talks about lessons learned from the transformative justice movement. So I would say to look there, um, and certainly it's a question that people are struggling through right now, um, and I don't think that there are any sort of firm answers for that, but people are struggling and trying to work through what those sort of mechanisms could look like.
Could you repeat that organization you mentioned? Or,
Oh, sorry. So it's not an organization; it's a book
oh,
um, called Beyond Survival.
Beyond
Uh,
Survival.
it's a compilation text uh, that talks about lessons learned from the transformative justice movement.
Thank you. Um, any last questions from the chat, everyone? Thanks for sticking with us, and yeah, thank you again, Jaden. This has been really awesome. I don't know. Are you still taking people for the study group? Is that full up? Do you want to mention that work or any other work you're working on?
Sure. So on Wednesday nights in July, I'm hosting a abolition political education group via Zoom. I have sort of like a prelim screening um, exercise for people to go through just so we can sort of know who's coming into our space. Um, and so we talk about, we go deeper into aspects of the prison abolition movement. So last or yesterday, we talked about gender-based violence and sort of abolitionist visions for what harm reduction could look like. Next week, we're talking about LGBTQ plus people and prison abolition. The week after that, we're talking about disability. And the week after that, we're talking about transnationalism and internationalism. So I welcome folks to come there. Uh, right now, we still have space. I'm trying to keep it manageable, but we still have space. And so I welcome folks to come there. And another sort of organization that ought to be lifted up in this moment is BYP 100. It's an organization a Black organization that sort of envisions a Black queer feminist future. It's an abolitionist organization, and they currently are working on a campaign called She Safe, We Safe, and it is looking at um, gender based violence and sexual harm and sort of how we can find anti-carceral ways to deal with that. So I would encourage folks to support their work as well.
Well, thank you so much, Jaden. Looks like we're at the end of our questions, unless anyone pops in with the last thing. Yeah, really wonderful to get this primer and yeah, hear your thoughts and abolition as anarchist future and lots to think about, lots to think about, and we will be putting this talk on YouTube for everyone to see and watch and revisit. Um, yeah, that's it for me on our end. Any final closing thoughts?
No, I thank everybody for coming and for having this opportunity to sort of share the things that I've learned over my abolitionist journey. And I hope that those thoughts, provocations, inspire the folks who are listening and perhaps the folks who are going to watch this on YouTube um, to reconsider their investments in the carceral state and maybe join us on the freedom side.
Thank you so much. All right, signing out. Have a good night, everyone.